By now, you've probably heard of my famous uncle, Jason Myers. It was a huge sensation when it happened. First the newspapers, then the investigation, then the book deal, the movie deal, the scandal, the hoax claims, and finally the well-deserved disappearance from the public eye. Every once in a while, his story still appears on documentaries and tabloids. He hasn't spoken publicly about the incident in years. In case you're the kind of person who, much like me, has little interest in the subject and thereby missed all the hoopla the first time around, I'll give you the short version. But first, let me say this. I never believed a single word of it. I'm no crackpot. I was 7 when it happened, and I was observant enough to know that Jason Myers was a good-for-nothing, flaky, perpetually unemployed, alcoholic lowlife. If there's anyone I know who would make up a bullshit story like this for personal gain, it would be him. There's only one problem. My dad, who I trust to be an honest, practical, pragmatic, down-to-earth, perfect opposite of Jason, has always supported his claim. He was there, at least for the first part. 10 years ago, my father, my uncle, and my father's friends, Derek Holly and Edgar Summers, embarked on what would prove to be their final fishing trip to Silent Lake. There, they would spend 4 days fishing, drinking, farting, and doing whatever the hell else it is that men do on such excursions. I wouldn't know. As his only daughter, I was never invited. On the 4th and final night, Jason and my father decided to take the John boat out for one last fishing expedition. According to my father's highly polished and frequently retold account of the event, it was a singularly beautiful night. The night sky was awash in billions of blazing stars, all reflected in the glossy surface of the water. They were the only boat on the lake, and in that perfect silence, they pondered the mysteries of the universe. I'm sure the cooler, cold Budweiser resting between them aided in their introspective mood. When it happened, my father was distracted by his first bite of the night. It was, he claims, a largemouth bass, so large it would be a crime to leave it unmounted on the wall of his den. He never had a chance to haul it, gasping into the boat. No sooner had it crested the water did Jason begin to raise his commotion, shouting and tugging at my father's shoulder. The bass snapped the line and fled, perhaps with a strange tale of its own to tell the other bass. Irritated by the distraction, my father began to ask Jason just what in the Sam hell had gotten into him, but the words died in his mouth. He said he looked up to where Jason was pointing and babbling, and saw what he could only describe as a UFO. It was a triangular craft roughly 100 feet long, to a side, perfectly silhouetted against the night sky. At each corner was a globe of light, alternating in color between a vivid green, a bold blue, and a deep red. In the center was a larger globe of light, which radiated a pale yellow. It gave off a deep, bassy hum, but showed no clear source of propulsion. It hovered perhaps 150 feet above their heads, completely motionless. Having gotten my father's attention, Jason fell into an awed hush. My father's reaction was much the same. He claims to have no idea of how long he stood there in the John boat, staring up at the craft, but eventually gained enough of his senses to tell Jason to fire up the motor and head back for shore. Jason did nothing, just stared up at the ship, mouth agape. Before my father could repeat himself, the lights on the ship flared up, blinding bright. The hum grew to a deafening level, so loud my father could not hear his own cries of terror. The next thing he knew, the UFO flew away so fast he could not even track its departure. There the story should have ended, a cute tale to tell around the campfire and believed by none, except as his eyes finally adjusted to the return of the darkness. My father saw something else, something that terrified him yet more than the strange craft and its strange departure. Jason left with it. My father was alone in the boat. Among the kit on the boat was a spotlight, and with it my father scanned the water, searching for any sign of his brother. Jason was, for all of his faults, adamant about wearing a life jacket whenever he was in the boat, and that night was no exception. If he had fallen overboard, there was no chance he might have drowned in the still waters, little as he wanted to admit it. After more than an hour of searching the lake, my father could come up with only a single explanation. Jason had been taken aboard the craft. Whatever strange creatures manned the UFO had, for whatever strange reason, abducted my uncle. When he returned to shore alone, he was met by Derek and Edgar. Both were in a state of panic, having seen the lights, heard the bizarre hum, and witnessed my father's desperate search. They found themselves in an impossible situation. The truth was unbelievable. To tell it would only invite ridicule. If they lied, how would they possibly explain Jason's absence? Finally, they resolved to tell a version of the story that skirted the truth, while supplying the most relevant piece of information, that Jason was gone, and they had no idea where he had gone to. The three of them drew straws to see who would stay and wait for his return. My father drew the short straw, and the others left to find help. I won't get into the circus that resulted, but to summarize, the entire sheriff's department came out and searched the lake for any sign of Jason until well into the daylight hours. They found nothing. They dredged the lake, intending to find his waterlogged corpse. No luck. A manhunt of the surrounding areas provided no further leads. It was strongly suspected that my father and his friends had, for one reason or another, killed Jason and buried his body. Finally, one of them, and no one would admit to having done it, leaked the UFO story, perhaps hoping to cast doubt on the suspicions of murder. With that unwelcome cat out of the bag, my father and his friends had no choice but to corroborate the story and stand by it. If anything, I admired their conviction. The following days were utter chaos. The book, entitled The Jason Myers Experience, Abduction at Silent Lake, and the feature-length film dramatization, Lights in the Sky, cover this part of the story in depth and with a fair amount of accuracy, so I won't get into it here. At any rate, I don't remember much of it. As I said, I was 7 at the time. All I could remember was the phone ringing constantly, plenty of arguments between my parents, and getting pulled out of school. The tall and the short of it was this. The UFO story made for compelling news, but everyone outside the tinfoil hat brigade was calling my father and his friends murderers. The idea frightened me much more than the prospect of little green men from Mars. One day, I was beaten up in the playground by a mob of other children. I was playing with my Barbies under the slide when another child, a boy I had known my entire life named Jacob Stanley, asked me where my uncle was buried. I didn't know what to say. The whole thing was very confusing to me. Another boy named Bradley Gifford said the Martians took him away, and the next thing I knew, I was surrounded. I told them to leave me alone, but someone started chanting, "Janie's daddy's a murderer." Pretty soon, they were all chanting it. I started bawling. I'm not sure where my mother was for all of this. Someone shoved me. I don't know who. I fell into a girl named Ashley Simon. She cried out, "Don't touch me, freak." And the next thing I knew, they fell upon me. I was punched, kicked, thrown to the ground, and dogpiled. Eventually, my cries reached the ears of my mother, who dragged the other kids off me, screaming admonishment. As far as I was concerned, it was too little too late. I was bruised, bloodied, and fully terrorized, all because of my uncle and his disappearing act. I didn't the capacity at the time to wish he really was dead, but the seed was there. I didn't leave the house after that. More than a week had passed since the night Uncle Jason disappeared. By then, the search effort was more or less exhausted, and the law was pressing on my father and his friends pretty hard. Through it all, they stuck with their story. There was even talk of the three of them submitting to a lie detector test, the results of which would not necessarily exonerate them, but would do much to clear their good names. They quickly agreed. It turns out the test never happened, because something else happened first. No one dared hope it would happen by that point. It had been 10 days exactly that Jason was missing, but it did. Jason came back. The call came in at the wee hours of the morning, and my parents raised such a ruckus that it woke me from a deep sleep. I crept down the stairs to see what was the matter. It seems the county sheriff had a man in custody claiming to be Jason Myers. He was naked, soaking wet, and terrified to the point of near incomprehensibility, but he was alive. Somehow, miraculously, these outer space aliens decided to return my uncle to the planet Earth, buck naked and some 20 miles from the site of his supposed abduction. Equally miraculous, my uncle returned to Earth just in time to exonerate my father and his cronies from any suspicion of foul play. Somehow, they never had to take a lie detector test. Right. The meat of the book detailed all of this. You can find it online, I'm sure, and you can get all the details. If you're reading this because you really and truly believe in Martians and alien abductions and crop circles and all of that happy horseshit, I'm sure my uncle's book will seem an ironclad testimony and irrefutable proof that the truth is out there. He, with the help of an uncredited ghostwriter named Ruth Mailer, spun a very rich yarn of his time aboard the starship and the numerous traumatic experiments the aliens performed upon his person. The movie was a very entertaining piece of science fiction, and none other than Nicolas Cage played the part of Jason Myers. My dad was played by Gary Lieutenant Dan Sinise. I forget the name of the little girl who played me in the film, but she had only one speaking line. It was, "I believe you, Uncle Jason," which, of course, I never said. I never did. Maybe you're wondering how a 7-year-old girl could have so little trust in her uncle, or so little a sense of wonder that she could not believe the fairy tale of visitors from the stars. So let me tell you a little bit of my earliest memories of the man. When I was 5 years old, Jason Myers came to live with us in our house. I didn't have the details then. It wasn't the sort of thing you told a 5-year-old. I later gathered from overheard conversations that he had lost his job and his apartment because of his drinking and had nowhere to go. Because he was a worthless piece of human refuse, he leached off my father's generosity and my mother's good nature for weeks, for months. I thought he would stay with us forever. He spent his days not looking for work or even pitching in around the house, but laying around on the couch watching daytime television and drinking. More than a few times, I smelled the pungent, acrid aroma I later learned to be marijuana smoke. I didn't understand him, and he didn't understand me. We gave one another space. His time with us ended catastrophically one stormy July night. My father's other brother had come to visit. Conrad was the oldest brother, and by all accounts, he was Jason's opposite. He was a pillar of the community, a successful business owner, and a family man. He rarely indulged in alcohol, and by all accounts, he had little contact with Jason. That night, he made an exception of both points, and it very nearly cost him his life. What I remember of that night was very little. As I said, I was 5. Over the years, I cajoled my mother into telling me exactly what went down as the evening progressed into night and revelry progressed into drunkenness. It seems my uncles came to a disagreement. No, that's not quite right. Jason made Conrad furious by alleging that Conrad's wife Cynthia was, quote, major boner material. I really had to ply that one out of Mom. It was the only time I had ever heard her say the word boner, before or afterward, since by then the night had progressed far beyond rational discourse. They instead began a brawl which stretched from my father's garage to a bridge at the end of the block. It was here that Jason attempted to crush Conrad's head with a rock, though thankfully he was too drunk to summon the needed dexterity before the police arrived. They both went to jail that night, and to my knowledge, never again spoke a civil word to one another. The intervening years between that incident and the alleged abduction did not see a dramatic turnaround in my uncle's life. Though my father made peace with him and his attempted murder, he never again sought long-term gainful employment or any meaningful bout of sobriety. When my uncle was abducted, he was so deeply in debt that it would take nothing less than a miracle to hoist him out of that pit. And then, one night, outside of the prying eyes of impartial witnesses, my uncle was abducted by aliens and returned with an entertaining and profitable story to tell. Have you ever noticed that the people who come forward with these accounts of alien encounters are usually, not always, but usually the same sort of backwoods rednecks, the sort of person who has no dignity to lose from making such outrageous claims, but everything to gain from selling their cockamamie stories to the tabloids? Jason's was a textbook case. With the proceeds from the book and the movie rights and all the interviews and whatnot, my uncle was miraculously able to pay off his debts and coast along for another decade. Do you see what I'm getting at? How hard would it be to fake all of this? Suppose instead of getting beamed away in the UFO, my dad drove my uncle to some old hunting shack or something like that to cool out for a couple of weeks. Someone leaks the alien story and gets everyone riled up. Then just at the right moment when the police are ready to start making arrests, Jason just shows up somewhere. Oh, so conveniently. Jason's terrifying account of his experiences on board an alien spaceship and encounters with the mysterious beings therein could have easily been cobbled together from dozens of pre-existing abduction accounts. As a matter of fact, there is a very similar case of an alleged abduction which took place in 1973 near Pascagoula, Mississippi, where not one but 2 men were abducted from their fishing boat and later returned. That one was also largely suspected to be a hoax, of course. All of this and more has been discussed in another book published not long after my uncle's account, this one entitled Lights Out, The Silent Lake Abduction Hoax, written by famed skeptic and professional debunker Merwin R. Gaskill. He paints an admittedly accurate picture of my uncle as a shiftless loser, professional scam artist, and consummate liar. However, despite his in-depth investigation into the case, character assassination, and baseless speculation are all he managed to produce. There was no smoking gun, so to speak. For all his credentials and boasts, he could not account for my uncle's absence those 10 strange days. That's how it works, of course. Wherever the burden of proof may actually lay, if my uncle's story could not be concretely disproved, its place in the annals of paranormal encounters was left intact. He could go to the bar any night of the week and negotiate free drinks, and every once in a while he received a residual check in the mail. Eventually, the general public will forget about the brief hysteria, and everyone's life more or less returns to normal. People eventually stopped connecting me and my family to the story, and I spent most of the last 10 years avoiding the man I generally thought of as my crazy Uncle Jason. I saw him every once in a great while at family gatherings and such. I didn't talk to him. He didn't talk to me. He hasn't been as wild in the recent years as he once was, probably just maturing with age. Honestly, I have to admit, he was sort of turning his life around by that point. He had a steady job, a roof over his head that was leased in his name, and if he didn't stop drinking entirely, at least he had dialed back on the drinking quite a bit. Maybe I let my guard down a little because of all of that. Maybe that's why I said what I said about the dreams. So in a way, maybe it was my fault when Jason Myers kidnapped me. Uncle Conrad was throwing a New Year's party. Friends, family, co-workers, anyone who could claim even a tenuous link to my uncle at the invite. It was a real big to-do. This year, the new year, would be accompanied by what the news programs promised to be a dazzling meteor shower. Uncle Conrad's house was far enough out into the country to be a prime viewing location, and the peak viewing window was to begin somewhere around 12:30 that night. As a result, the party was still roaring long after the ball dropped. I might have been bored senseless to be stuck at my uncle's party all night long, but fortunately, the half of the town Conrad had invited also dragged their kids along. There were plenty of other people at the party around my age, including Skylar Tomlinson. Skylar was popular, athletic, recently single, and owner of the most beautiful face I had ever witnessed. I spent the entire evening trying to get him to notice me without being too obvious about it. I literally remember nothing else about the party. The music, the crowds, the food, the drink, the countdown. It was all a blur to me. Standing in the middle of that blur in perfect focus at all times. Skylar. The night was unseasonably warm, I remember that. My uncle had set up numerous fire pits around the yard for people to gather around, but they were hardly needed. We were gathered around one of the outlying pits in chaise lounges, watching the sky and talking amongst ourselves. Along with Skylar and myself were 3 or 4 others. My best friend Bethany Wilkins was there performing beautifully as my wing lady, doing her best to make me seem funny and cool. Ashley Simon, who, as you may remember as the girl who called me a freak on the playground, was there as well. She was still a stuck-up skank, and I hated her like poison, but she was there with Caleb Tomlinson, Skylar's brother. I pretended to be nice to her, while secretly hoping one of the meteors would fall out of the sky and hit her squarely in her too large forehead. Colby Wilkins was there too, sort of, but he was only 10 and he didn't really count. He just wanted to tag along with his sister. Somewhere around 1 in the morning, we were still watching the meteor shower, passing around a flask of rum Caleb had smuggled from his dad's liquor cabinet. I didn't drink much, just took a few tiny sips so no one would think I was a nerd. I sat between Bethany and Skylar, feeling good, and watching the stars fall. I touched Skylar's hands a few times accidentally on purpose, and he looked at me and smiled. 3 meteors fell in a row, one right after another, and it sparked a memory. Ordinarily, I wouldn't have said anything, but I suppose I might have had a bit more rum than I thought, and it loosened my lips. I said, "I think I had a dream about this last night." "Yeah?" Skylar asked. He looked genuinely interested, which sparked me on. "Totally. Except I didn't know about the fire pits, or whatever, you know. So in the dream, I was watching the meteor shower from my bedroom. I remember in the dream there were 3 meteors in a row, just like that a minute ago." "So what happened?" Bethany asked, leaning forward. Such a good winged lady. She always tried to make my lame stories seem better than they were. "Well," I told him, remembering the dream more and more as I retold it. "A little while after the 3rd meteor fell, there was another one, and this one was so bright, it lit up the sky at the middle of the day. Like, it was dazzling, you know? It was so bright, it lit up my room even. And that's..." I stopped, suddenly remembering I didn't like this dream. "What happened then? You wet the bed?" "Ashley." "Skank." Caleb cackled, took a long swig of the rum, and squeezed Ashley's thigh. I scowled at them. "No, Ashley. Shut up," I told her, and fell silent. The moment was lost, and we stared up at the sky as if for waiting for some kind of cue. "What did you see?" Skylar asked quietly. He held my hand, and my heart leaped in my chest. I forgot all about Ashley just then. "Well," I answered, just above a whisper. When the room lit up, I realized I wasn't alone. There were other people in there, standing beside my bed. I could only see them from the corner of my eyes, but they frightened me so badly that I woke up. I heard a sound close by and turned. There at the next fire pit over, I saw my Uncle Jason. He had turned to look at me, and he had a strange look in his eyes. Then Skylar said something to me, and I turned back to ask him to repeat himself. "That's pretty freaky," he said. "Yeah," I said. Then someone, I think it was Caleb, changed the subject. I didn't think any more about the dream, and I forgot all about Uncle Jason and his weird look. The night wore on, and I eventually passed out in one of Uncle Conrad's guest bedrooms. I woke up in the back of Uncle Jason's van. Of course, I didn't know that at the time. My rise to consciousness was slow, and awareness came bit by bit, like one of those old televisions that had to warm up before they'd show you the picture. My grandpa still had one, and I used to marvel at its primitive bulk, like a relic from a nearly forgotten civilization. My head TV was still buzzing, and there was no picture yet. There was no picture because there was something tied around my face. A blindfold. I shifted around and realized all my limbs were still asleep. Television static. No, not just that. I was tied up. I moaned something softly, my speakers unwilling to give anything but feedback. Something was wrong. Something was very wrong. I could hear a sound like a low roar, more a vibration than a noise. Above that, I heard music. Classic rock. Lynyrd Skynyrd. No, it was Creedence Clearwater Revival. Someday never comes. The strange menacing tune fed my unease, and I shifted more, trying to understand my surroundings. I didn't dare speak. I was too frightened. Through whatever thin padding I lay upon, I could feel hard metal and that constant vibration. I was in a vehicle, my brain unnaturally sluggish, finally put it together. I was being kidnapped. I cried out. I couldn't help it. "Shh, girl, shh," came a voice from nearby, trying and failing to be soothing. Go back to sleep now. We're almost there. Uncle Jason? I cried. What's going on? Stupid question. What else could be happening? This would be one hell of a way to set up a surprise party for me. It was not even my birthday. You're gonna have to trust me, Janie. I'll explain everything when we get there. I promise I'm not gonna hurt you. I'd never hurt you. Your family. I was positive he was going to hurt me. I don't know why, but I thought maybe I could talk him out of it. You don't have to do this, Uncle Jason. You can take me back home. I won't tell anyone. I promise. It'll be like nothing ever happened. Silence. Some day never comes ended, and it was replaced by the doors. East Frog. Blood on the streets. Finally, he spoke, sounding strange and forlorn. I can't. I gotta try to help you. I gotta try. Hush up now. We'll be there soon. I'll get you out of them fetters. But Uncle Jason, I insisted. Hush now, he cried, his voice quavering with an energy that could be the edge of panic. I mean it, girl. I'm too keyed up as it is. Listen to the music and chill out. If I get pulled over for driving strange or looking like I'm talking to nobody, both of us are going to be in a world of hurt. I took his advice, too afraid to do otherwise. There was a great deal of threat hidden in his message. Peace Frog gave way to Gimme Shelter. The Stones. Why did these old rock songs seem so strange and threatening? Maybe it was just the situation that made it seem that way. Eventually, I could feel Jason's van slow and turn down a side road. It was a country road by the feel of it, maybe gravel. The hum of the highway gave way to the grind and the jostling that spoke of an end to the pavement. Another turn, another rough road, another turn, and a rougher road still. This one must have been nothing more than a dirt track. Time passed, marked only by the steady stream of classic rock tunes. Steppenwolf, Led Zeppelin, many and more. Some I couldn't name. Can you blame me? I was 17. It was only thanks to my dad that I knew as much as I did. My dad. Surely by now, he knows I'm missing. But would he know Jason was the culprit? As many people as were at the party last night, it could have been anyone. Still, surely the crazy and unaccounted for uncle would be the top suspect, right? The police were probably looking for us now, and they'd find us any minute. Surely they would, unless they didn't know what to look for. As far as I knew, Uncle Jason drove an old Ford single cab truck. This had to be a van, and where he would have gotten such a thing, I had no idea. A rental? That meant he had been planning this for a while. Or so I thought. And if he rented a van, there would be a record. His name would be on a form somewhere, and they could follow that as easily as his own truck. Wishful thinking. I could feel by the jolts and jumps that we were well off the beaten path. If the police were going to find us and stop Jason, they probably would have by now. With everyone sleeping off their monster New Year hangover, he could have gotten one hell of a head start. I didn't even know how long we had been on the road. I struggled and pulled at my bonds, but all I managed to accomplish was hurting my wrists and ankles. Stupid. What would I have done if I got loose? Cracked Jason over the head with a blunt object while he was driving? I didn't have a big urge to fly through the windshield and splatter myself into a tree. So what was I supposed to do? I started crying. I didn't mean to. It just started happening. Nobody was going to save me. God knows what Jason had planned. Was he going to hurt me? Rape me? Fuck. What did I do to deserve this? A ragged sob escaped me. Jason heard, and he said, Oh, honey, please don't cry like that. I know you're scared right now. Hell, I'm scared too. But look, I think if you do just what I say, we're gonna be okay. All right, sweetie, I've done a lot of figuring on this, in case something like this were to happen. A heavier song came on the radio. Sinister, sludgy riffs and Ozzy Osbourne's unmistakable vocals. Naibi, we're coming up on the place now, he continued. As I said, I'm gonna let you loose of those bonds when we get there. Ain't no worry of you running off or getting into trouble. We're miles and miles from civilization now. Ain't nowhere to go. If he was trying to comfort me, he was doing a piss-poor job of it. I felt like I was maybe going to throw up. We drove on for some time longer. I have no idea how much time. I only know that Ozzy gave way to another tune, one I didn't recognize. Then a couple I did. Rhiannon by Fleetwood Mac and Voodoo Child by Jimi Hendrix. Then a few more, but I spaced out for a bit, unable to concentrate on the music for all my terror and panic. Finally, some interminable space of time later, the van slowed, slalomed through some unknown obstacles, and settled to a stop. Jason shut off the engine, threw open the door, and stepped out. I could hear him stretch and groan and shake out the miles. He was going to touch me soon. I started to shiver. The door slid open, and he saw me there shaking. He said, "Don't carry on so, girl. I told you I wasn't going to let you come to harm, and I damn well mean to keep my promises. Now you hold real still, Janie girl. I'm fixing to cut you loose." He took me by the legs, and I tried not to cringe too much from his loathsome touch. I realized he was very close to totally unhinged, and his promise would prove very breakable if I provoked him. He pulled my feet out the door so they were hanging in the air and guided me into a sitting position. His touch, little as I cared to admit it for all my fear, was remarkably gentle. "I'm gonna pull off your blindfold first, Janie girl," he told me close enough that I could smell his sour breath. It stank of a long night and a bad morning. "I want you to look me straight in the eye so I know you hear what I have to tell you." "Okay." I nodded. I couldn't trust myself to speak. He pulled the blindfold off, and for the first few moments I saw nothing, save for a dazzling light. I gasped in shock, more than pain. Soon the light faded, and shape and color began to define itself. I saw my uncle's face before me, unshaven and wild-looking. He wore a trucker cap which read FBI Federal Breast Inspector, with a crude drawing of comically large breasts. His hazel eyes were trained on mine. He said, "Now, Janie, look me right in the eyes and hear what I'm saying, okay?" "Okay," I squeaked. I tried my best to look into his eyes. "I'm gonna cut the ropes from your arms and legs. You're gonna be free to move around such as you wish. I imagine you likely have to go visit the facilities now, and you're welcome to do so just as soon as you're free." "Okay," I nodded. I didn't realize it until he said something, but I desperately had to pee. "But maybe you're reserving thoughts of kicking your poor uncle in the throat just as soon as your legs are free and hauling butt for the tree line." I hadn't thought of that, at least not until he said as much. "Let me put that thought out of your mind. That out there," he told me, gesturing to the dense forest surrounding us, "is the very picture of American wilderness. Maybe you don't think there's such a thing left in these modern times, but that there is the wild, you get me? There's bear out there, there's cougars, bobcats, God knows what all. More than that, there's miles and miles of forest, the likes of which a city girl like you would get lost in straight away and fall down a ravine or some such." He let this information sink in. It sunk. All I could hear in the world was the cries of birds and beasts, and my own ragged breathing, he gestured toward a rustic old cabin, gray with age and choked in every corner and eave with dry leaves. Heavy shutters bookended every window. That there cabin may not look like much, but it's a fortress meant to withstand 4 seasons of abuse from the elements, and is the closest thing to a fortress, as you're likely to find out here. It was old when my grandpa was young. Nobody knows about this place that could link it to me. No one's gonna look for us here. We're safe from the world, and by God, we're safe from them, from outside anywhere. It's here. You stay with me, and I'll do all in my power to make sure you're safe, Janie girl. I promise you that. You have my word. He stared into my eyes, maybe to show me his sincerity. Tried not to start bawling. I didn't think there was much hope of ever seeing my family and friends again. I won't do anything, I whispered. Jason nodded and untied my arms and legs. It was several minutes more before I had enough feeling in any of my extremities to even think about walking. As soon as I was ambulatory, he led me around to the far side of the cabin and gestured to what I initially took to be a small shed. That there's the facilities. Ain't much, but it's clean. If you go number 2, sprinkle a scoopful of the lime from the bucket in there. I'll be in the cabin setting things up. I grimaced, but I thought that if the worst thing to happen to me today was having to use a scummy old outhouse, then things were going to go a lot better than I expected. He handed me a roll of toilet paper and immediately turned back to set things up at the cabin, whatever that might entail. I assumed it meant chasing out the family of raccoons and rewarding himself with a case of beer. The inside of the outhouse wasn't nearly as disgusting as I had expected. It didn't smell like much of anything except musty old wood. I figured it hadn't been used for a while. As I went about my business, I tried to think of some way I could overpower my uncle, get the keys from him, and make my escape. All I managed to do was whip myself into another crying frenzy. Eventually, the frenzy faded to sobs, and not long after that, I realized I would eventually have to leave the outhouse and listen to Jason's undoubtedly delusional reasoning for having kidnapped me. I dried my eyes with a wad of toilet paper and tried to put on a brave face. I thought that if I played at believing Jason's story, I could delay my inevitable murder long enough for an opportunity to present itself. I wasn't going to let him rape me, though. I'd tear out his throat with my teeth before I would let that happen. I'd rip out his eyes with my fingernails. Just let him try. Somehow, this thought gave me the strength to leave the musty old shithouse and march to the cabin. Jason was just inside, sitting at a table smoking a cigarette. He wasn't drinking yet. There was something in his posture, in the set of his jaw, that almost made me believe he was as scared as I was. Maybe he was. I didn't know much about crazy people, but I figured after a while they believed in their own stories. "Do you want a cigarette?" he asked, then winced. "Sorry, I forgot. You're still just a kid." "No," I said, "give me one." I had never smoked before, but I couldn't think of a better time to start. He shrugged and passed me the pack and a lighter. I pulled out a cigarette. They smelled kind of pleasant before they were lit. I put it in mouth and lit it. The smoke burned my throat, made my eyes water, but I managed not to choke on it like you always see on TV. I didn't like it, but I didn't put it out either. Jason stared at me, looking like he had something to say and was searching for the right way to start. He started a new cigarette on the dying ember of the old one and said, "You never believed me, did you? About the aliens, I mean." My mind raced to find an answer, that would not upset him. Should I lie? Tell the plain truth? He waved me off, disturbing the smoke that hung in the air. No, you don't have to say. I know you never did. I could see it in your eyes. That's okay. Hell, I never believed in any of that crap either. Thought that Christopher Walken guy in the movie was full of shit. You know the one? Communion. He wrote books about monsters, you know. Vampires, werewolves, all that shit. Figured he made all that up about the little gray men too. Just pretended it was a true story, so he could sell more books. But you believe him now? I suggested. Hell no, I don't, he scoffed. Here's why. All of that new agey bullshit, in the end, about how the aliens come with a message of peace and harmony for all mankind, it wasn't like that at all. They don't give two shits about us. They just want to use us. Use us for what? I asked. I was trying my best to seem interested. I had been half listening and avoiding this sort of tirade from him for half of my life. It was just this fiction he had built up for himself, and he had been doing it for so long that he started to believe his own lies. He stared at me gravely and said, "Nothing good. Think of a cruel boy with an ant colony. Those ants are nothing to him but a source of amusement when there's nothing good on TV. He might drown them with water or burn them with a magnifying glass, but teaching them about love and brotherhood wouldn't even cross his mind. They're like that, sort of. Best comparison I can think of. Now think of how smart and developed a human being is compared to an ant. Those bastards are at least that much higher than us. We can sting them, maybe, but we can't stop them. They'll come back whenever it pleases them." "So what do they want with you?" I asked. His comparison was weak on this point. A cruel boy may harm an ant colony, but what would he have to gain from singling out a particular ant? He gave me that strange look again, the same from the night before. It was a desperately fearful, pitying look. I knew what he was going to say before he said it. They don't want anything from me, or if they did, they already took it. Janie girl, they want you. This made sense, at least as the sequence of events that lead us here, but I was still perplexed. Me? I asked. What would they want with me? Jason averted his eyes and seemed to study the tip of his cigarette. It was getting short, so maybe he was thinking of lighting another. Finally, he said, "Have you ever heard of hybrids?" I had. "Yeah, we learned about them in biology. Like you make a mule by crossing a donkey and a horse, right?" He nodded. "Just like that. Now I can't say for sure this is the case, but I've read a lot of other abduction cases. Most of them are probably bullshit like that communion guy, but not all of them. They couldn't be. I know that. There's too many of the details from other people's story match my own, you see?" I nodded. I could easily see how one person's delusions could be propped up by other people's delusions. Even after all the hypnosis sessions I went through, I still don't remember everything that happened when I was up there. Just flashes, really. I was locked up in a strange little cell covered in some slop. I was being sort of wheeled through these corridors by those things, on my back looking up at the ceiling. I was strapped to a table with all of them looking down at me. Other things, every once in a while, another memory, another flash will crop up. "And these hybrids?" I asked. One woman I had read about, a woman named Bridget M., claimed that the aliens could no longer breed among themselves normally. She claims that she had been taken and impregnated by the aliens many times over the course of her life. She would find herself pregnant, carry the baby for a few months, and lose the child for no reason she could see. It was only under hypnotic regression that she learned of her abductions, how the Greys would inseminate her and then remove the hybrid child later. She claimed to have even met some of her hybrid children. What did they look like? I asked. In spite of myself, I found myself pulled into the narrative of his insane ravings. She said they were strange and beautiful. They were thin and pale, and their heads were somewhat larger than that of a normal human child. They had large eyes that were the same blue as her own eyes, and long, silvery blonde hair. The mental image that came up in my mind was of Macaulay Culkin, and I almost laughed. It seems he could see the disbelief on my face. Yeah, I kind of thought the same as you. There was no way that could be true. It'd be like a person and a dog making love and coming out with a dog man. Something like that. Only I remembered something a little better next time I was in my hypnotherapy. I recalled before that I had seen other humans on board the ship, and I kind of concluded they were other abductees, you know. Only this time I could call them up a little clearer, and I could see they weren't true humans. They were hybrids, like the lady said. Hearing her story unlocked the memory, you could say. Or else you heard her story and blended it into your own, I thought. So wait, I said. That's what this is about. You think the aliens want to take me and put an alien baby in me? That's disgusting. I would never. Darling, they wouldn't give you the choice. They'd do it to you just as often as they felt like doing it. And there wouldn't be much you could do about it. The other thing is, that woman, Bridget, she went up and disappeared some time after telling her story. Not a damn person knows what happened to her. I felt sick to my stomach. Thank God it was all a fantasy. Bad enough I should worry about being raped by him, but by some disgusting bug-eyed creature. It was nightmarish. Then there was the other thing, the thing I wouldn't dream of telling him. It was nothing, though. Surely nothing. But I was late. Just a little. But I was late just the same. I didn't really think too much about it before, because I wasn't sleeping with anybody. I was a virgin, but I was late. But it happens. My cycle is normally like clockwork, but it happens. I bit my lip. Now, Janie, Jason said, leaning forward and looking into my eyes. Think real hard. That dream you had about the lights and the strangers in your room. Do you remember anything else? I thought as hard as I could, but that was all I remembered. I couldn't even remember what the strangers looked like. I never looked straight at them. I thought they were just people, and I told him so. He considered this and said, "Do you ever remember having a dream like that before? Anything about lights in the sky or people in your room? Anything like that?" I shook my head. I hardly ever remembered my dreams at all. Did you ever remember seeing an owl out your bedroom window? Anything like that? An owl? I asked. No, not that I can recall. He fell silent for a moment and appeared to be thinking things over. He lit another cigarette, took a few puffs, and said, "Well, I guess we can't know for sure. They have some way of making you forget. Still, I think there's a good chance that was your first encounter. They probably haven't done anything yet. I know a way we can tell for sure." "How?" "They'd have put a tracker on you. It looks like a little piece of metal, but it's not. It's a beacon of sorts, and it'll lead them straight to you, no matter where you are. They implant it under the skin, and most of the time you wouldn't know it was there unless you knew to look for it. Mine was in the back of my thigh. I had to use a hand mirror to find it. There'll be a strange scar or little mark, something like that. Have you noticed any marks on your body you can't account for? I scanned my arms almost reflexively and said, "No, nothing." "You're positive?" he said, frowning. How could I be positive about something like that? I didn't scour every inch of my body every day looking for weird marks. Also, I was 17, and weird marks showed up on my skin on a fairly regular basis. They're called pimples, so I was a little uncertain when I told him, "Yes, I'm certain." He frowned more deeply and said, "Shit. I really didn't want to have to do this, but it's not good enough to be 50, 75, or 95% sure. If you're not 100% sure there ain't no mark on you that could be a tracker, we need to find out. Otherwise, this is all gonna be for nothing. They'll come right to us." "What are you talking about?" I demanded, suddenly terrified. He stood up, crossed to the window, and peered out. Nodding, he pulled the shutters and repeated the process on the other window. Next, he threw a bar across the door, gave it a solid shake, and nodded again. "Now you need to know that I am your uncle, and I never once harbored a single unclean thought about you. No matter what you might think of me, I would never do anything so heinous as to touch you or look at you with any sort of lustful thoughts. That is the furthest thing from my mind. Do you get me?" I nodded, tears already running down my face. This was it. This was the moment I knew was coming from the start. My skin crawled all over in dreadful anticipation. "I mean it, Janie. Just think of this like it's a doctor's examination. That's all it is. If I find something, it won't be no big deal. It'll just be like removing a splinter. Now strip down, undies and all. Sooner we get started, sooner it'll be over." "No!" I cried, crossing my arms over my breasts as though they were already exposed, and backpedaled. He sidestepped and intercepted me at the door. There was nowhere to go. I noticed something in his hand, shining in the dim light. It was a scalpel. My heart thudded in my chest and I stumbled back over my chair. He raced over to help me off the ground, and I screamed negation at him until he backed away. The scalpel and the power was still in his hand. "We got to do this, Janie. Don't you get it?" He advanced upon me, not quite brandishing the blade, but neither did he hide it. "If they find us here, there's no telling what will become of us. I've got to know if you've got a tracker on you, and I'm going to find out one way or another. Now quit fighting me, and let's get this over with." "Don't touch me," I cried, though I knew full well the futility of the situation. "I won't touch anything you don't want me to, Janie girl. You have my word. I won't touch you at all unless it's to get the tracker out of you. Now quit fussing and strip down, you mind me. Strip down before I have to do it for you." "God damn you," I whispered. Sobbing, I began to undress. I could feel his eyes crawling over me, and I felt shame and loathing wage a nauseating war in my guts. Every time I hesitated, he gestured with the knife and told me to go on. His expression was even, at least. I could not see any lust in his eyes. Not that it mattered. If he could convince himself of the whole alien narrative, then convincing himself that he wanted me to undress purely to check for trackers was no great leap. He didn't have to watch me while I did it. Soon my clothes were lying on the floor around me. I stood there red-faced and weeping, shivering in the chilly cabin, trying my best to conceal my nakedness with my arms. I thought of myself, only hours ago, happy and safe, surrounded by friends, and marveled at how a single, careless anecdote brought me to this terrible place. Jason produced a pen light and told me to stand with my arms straight out and my feet shoulder-width apart. I complied quickly, fearing his touch as much as the knife in his hand. He began to examine me, and I closed my eyes, praying for this humiliation to come to an end. I couldn't stand to know when he would be staring at my tits, at my crotch. God, it seemed to go on for hours. Every once in a while, he would find a mole or an old scar and question me about it. Had I noticed it before? How long have I had it? Where did it come from? I tried to have answers ready as quickly as possible, for fear he would decide it was an alien tracker device and cut me open. "What's this?" he demanded. He was crouched down at my feet, his penlight trained upon my right calf. "What?" I cried, certain I would feel the blade bite into my flesh. "These bumps on your leg here, what are they?" I looked down at my calf, fresh waves of shame crawling over me as I was made once again aware of my nakedness. There were 3 bumps on my calf, all close together. "It's just razor bumps. I shaved my legs before the party. I get razor bumps sometimes." I was almost certain this was the truth. "Razor bumps," Jason repeated doubtfully. "All close together like that?" "Yeah," I quickly replied. "It tends to happen that way. I don't usually get them, but when I do, they come in little clusters like that." I was just in a rush, trying to finish. Mom was banging on the bathroom door. That's how it happened. Jason stared at that spot for a long time, and despite the chill in the room, I began to sweat. What is it about anticipating pain that made it so much worse? Finally, he asked, "You're absolutely sure? You understand how important it is that you are sure, right? This could be life or death." I knew that it was a matter of life or death that he believed me, that he would believe the aliens would not find us without him having to cut me open. That was the importance I gave to the situation. I told him, "Yes, I'm absolutely sure. I'm positive that those bumps are razor bumps." A brief, terrible pause, and he said, "Okay, let me see the bottoms of your feet now." I lifted each foot in turn and submitted them for his inspection. He made a small grunt and told me to set my foot down. "Okay," he told me, "go ahead and put your clothes on, Janie girl. I'm really sorry to have to put you through all that indignity. It won't happen again. I'll fix us something to eat, all right?" I let out a ragged sigh of relief as he turned his back to me, and I quickly gathered my clothes. How I could ever bear to be naked again. He unbarred the door and departed, only to return moments after I finished dressing, his arms loaded with grocery bags. He must have bought them while I was passed out in the van. As he passed, he seemed to have trouble meeting my gaze and proceeded to the kitchen without another word, alone again for the moment. The room was lit only by an electric lantern suspended by a hook in the ceiling. I threw open the shutters, preferring the fading light of day while I could have it. The decor was sparse, and a few spiders had taken residence in the corners, but all in all, the cabin was not nearly as disgusting as I had anticipated. The furniture had been covered by drop cloths which lay in a pile on the corner, and so they were dust-free or close to it. I sat in a chair and pondered my fate. I thought about the possibility that I would have to kill Jason to earn my freedom, but the idea repulsed me. I could never hurt anyone, could I? But what else could I do? He wasn't going to let me go free. I was certain of that. Never in my life did I ever have to feel so lonely and afraid, so hopeless. I started to weep again, uncontrollably. How could he do this? The parallel between what he claimed and possibly believed to have experienced and the horror he was subjecting me to was plain to see. I was helpless before his demands, his cold examination, and sinister motives. I always thought he was a harmless crank, clinging to the fiction that granted him his 15 minutes of fame. Nothing more than that. Now I knew better, but I would have given anything to remain ignorant. I rose from the chair, too antsy to remain seated, crossed to the window. The landscape was stark, barren, leafless trees, pressed in all around us, endless. I could follow the road on foot, what little road there was to follow, but I had no way of knowing how far we were from the nearest town. It was unseasonably warm for January, but I was barefoot and woefully underdressed. How far would I get before a bear or a wolf caught my scent? I stood on the floor of a cabin situated on solid ground, but for all intents and purposes, I might as well have been aboard Jason's alien spaceship, whizzing through the stars. Behind me, the kitchen door opened and Jason appeared. I wheeled around, unwilling to turn my back on him. He was smiling sadly at me. While in the kitchen, he had doffed his lewd ball cap, and his graying hair was all corkscrews and cowlicks. Somehow, I almost felt sorry for him. He must have been nearly as lonely as I was. "Dinner's ready," he said. I made my specialty, macaroni and cheese, tuna, and peas. Best I could do, having only canned meat to work with. I was going to get a generator for the place, but I'm afraid we're going to have to rough it for the time being. At least the place has well water. It's crisp and clean. I followed him in the kitchen, certain I could not bear to eat a thing, but lacking the strength to put up a fight. The smell of hot food changed my mind. I realized then that I was ravenously hungry. I sat at the dining room table, and he set a plate before me, along with a can of soda. I dug in, muttering a word of thanks. It was surprisingly good for a bowl of bachelor chow. Jason sat across me, silently eating his own serving. He also had a can of soda to accompany his meal, and I was glad at least he wasn't drinking alcohol. His eyes, I noticed, were red-rimmed. For a wonder, I realized that he too had been crying. Did he regret his actions, kidnapping me and imprisoning me here in the wilderness? I stared down at my empty bowl, and he asked, "Want some more?" I did, and I nodded. He took my bowl and served out another scoop of the crude casserole. "Uncle Jason?" I asked. "Yeah," he replied. "What are you going to do with me?" "I'm gonna make sure you're safe from those damn things," he told me. "I won't let them have you. I'll lay down my life before I let that happen." Could I reason with him? I wasn't sure, but I had to try. "What's your end game here?" I asked. "You know we can't stay up here forever, right?" He didn't answer. Good God, had he even thought things through that far? I strongly suspected he hadn't. "No, we can't," he said finally. "But we can hold out here for a short stretch. Long enough maybe that those gray bastards will go looking for another victim. If they visited you, but they hadn't tracked you yet, that's good news." "How do you know they'll just give up?" I had to ask. "I don't, not for sure. I think maybe they chose you because of me. They saw something in my genes they wanted, I guess. That's the nearest I can figure. I never had a kid of my own they could take. So that means you were the next best thing. Shit. But they must have other irons in the fire, so to speak. Maybe when you ain't there the next time, they'll just move on to the next girl. That's the best I got to go on." "That's a lot of maybes," I said. I felt a little better after having eaten something, but that feeling of hopelessness remained. Don't I know it, he agreed, but it's the best we got to go on. Maybe when we get back to civilization, I can convince your daddy to keep a close watch on you. He was there when I was taken, and so he's the only son of a bitch on this whole planet I know has my back. I imagine he'll be a bit sore though, me having run off with you without telling him. Wasn't no time for that. I had no idea if my dad really believed all of this, or if he was just covering for Jason. He never talked about it, not to me at least. He said he had his fill of the whole story years ago after telling his part of the story, untold dozens of times. He never called my uncle a liar though, never even suggested he might be telling anything less than the truth. Dad was too forgiving of Jason, I know that. Mom would complain about it sometimes, never when he was around to hear it, of course. It was a tender subject. She resented him for dragging my father into a world of scandal and suspicion, for taking advantage of brotherly love. She could see him for who he really was, just like I did, although, in light of current circumstances, none of us knew or suspected half of it, not even after the incident with the rock. My instincts told me he would never let me go. All this talk of going back to civilization was just another in a long stream of lies and deceptions. I felt sick all over again. The macaroni roiled in my stomach violently. I wondered how long it would be before he decided to hurt me again, to touch me. Maybe I'd feel better if I could just put a wall between us. I'm feeling kind of worn out, I told him. I think I'm going to lay down. Sure, kid, he said. Get some rest. We can play some cards later on if you're feeling up to it. I think I'm going to step outside and get a bit of fresh air myself. Bedrooms are just down the hall there. Take your pick. I nodded and stepped away with my bowl and soda can. I tossed the can and cleaned the bowl out with a rag. I wasn't trying to be a good guest or anything. It was just the sort of habit my parents ingrained in me. I heard a slapping sound and turned around with a start. It was Uncle Jason, smacking a fresh pack of cigarettes against the flat of his palm, packing the tobacco. He stepped through the door without a nod over his shoulder. The bedroom on the left, for no other reason than it was the closest, and shut the door behind me. There was no lock, of course. I glanced around the room and found an old chair that seemed sturdy enough. I had seen people on TV block a door with a chair, though I had no idea if it actually worked. It didn't. Maybe it could have if the floors were carpeted, but there was nothing here for it to catch on. It just slid down to the floor uselessly. I sighed and threw the drop cloth off the bed. The bed was made, and it looked like it had never been used. A small comfort. I threw myself down on the bed and stared up at the ceiling. I was tired, but my nerves were still jangling, and I couldn't settle down. That was okay. I felt better just being alone. Maybe a grizzly bear would eat Jason while he was out there chain smoking, and I would be okay. I felt so stupid. A girl in a book would think of a clever plan, outwit her captor, and escape. It was all I could manage, not to bawl my eyes out and puke macaroni and tuna all over the floorboards. I guess this was how kidnappings really went. No clever plans, just imprisonment and eventual murder. Hell, I wish the aliens were real. I'd rather be with them, all things considered. They let Jason go once they were done poking and prodding at him. It was quiet in a way I never knew before. Living in the city, I could always hear the sounds of life. I could hear cars on the street, the shouts of the people on the sidewalk, the neighbors, my parents. I even missed the hum of electricity, and until it was gone, I don't think I ever noticed it. I couldn't even hear birds here. Cold as it was, they had all packed up and moved south. I hated it, the silence. What if they never find out what happened to me? What if they never connect my disappearance to my crazy uncle? Dad wouldn't believe it, I know that. Not Jason, not his baby brother. But I couldn't resent him for seeing the best in everyone, could I? I could end up in a shallow grave, lost forever, and eventually forgotten. That did it. I started crying again, furious at myself for being so useless. Almost as furious as I was at Uncle Jason for tearing my life away from me and acting all contrite, like it was something he had to do, instead of the culmination of years of sick fantasy. God, I hated him. No use trying to sleep away the hours. All I was doing was winding myself up more. I sat up, screwing my fists into my eyes. I cried out in frustration, though I cut myself off for fear Jason would hear and come barging in. If I saw him, I would scream. I knew it. The hell of it all was that I did not know, had no way to know how committed he was to this alien bullshit. Did he really think he was abducted? Did he really think he was protecting me? Or was it all a willful fabrication, an attempt to lower my defenses before he struck? If he believed, maybe I could manipulate him into letting me go. But if he didn't, I would only make an ass of myself before dying. I agonized in indecision. I don't know for how long. The only answer I kept coming back to was that I had to kill him if I wanted to escape. I didn't think he would expect it from me, and that gave me an edge. The fact that I had no weapons and weighed a good 100 pounds less than him were, needless to say, serious disadvantages to that plan. Eventually, I did fall asleep. I guess it's draining to be caught in a frenzied cycle of fear, anger, and despair. The sleep was fitful and not especially restful, but it was an escape of a kind, at least. I awoke in the darkness to the call of my bladder. Fuck. I would have to face him again. I guessed it was inevitable. I stepped out into the living room and saw him playing solitaire at the table. The air was murky with cigarette smoke. He smiled wanly at me as he laid a card down. A bag of potato chips lay open on near to his right hand. "Hey there, sleepyhead," he said, as if everything was normal. "Thought you were going to sleep the whole night through. It's near on 10. "I have to go to the bathroom," I announced, feeling myself blush. He frowned and said, "I'd better go with you." "No," I cried, feeling the blush turn my face beet red. "It's not safe to go out there alone after dark. You don't know what's out there." "I'll be fine," I insisted. "If I see any bears or whatever, I'll run for the door." "I don't want you standing outside the door while I take a piss. It's embarrassing." He considered this and finally said, "Okay, but you see or you hear anything out there, you run back here like your hair was on fire and your ass was catching. You hear? You run back a-hollering so I can know something's up." "I promise you, Uncle Jason," I told him, "that will not be a problem." "Good," he said. "Now run along. Slap." Another card on the table. I turned to leave, but he called me back. "Where's my head at? Janie girl, it is pitch black out there." He rose and rifled through a bag near at hand. He pulled out a flashlight. "Take this." I took the light from him, mumbling a thank you, and stepped outside. God, it was cold, and I was barefoot. Dark, too. He wasn't kidding. I couldn't even see the tree line in the moonless night. I was suddenly afraid of more than just the psychopath in the cabin. I feared the dark and the things that might be stalking under its cover. I wouldn't even scan the trees for fear of illuminating watchful eyes. My need to urinate became all the more urgent, and I rushed for the outhouse. I was thankful, at least, that I had already used it, and so knew where to find it. Between the doorway and the outhouse, my feet barely touched the ground, and I swung the door shut, with my heart pounding and gasping for breath. It was a near thing to pull my pants down and sit in time before the party started without me, so to speak. When it was done, I found myself alone in the dark with a gulf of unknown between me and the door to the cabin. What if something was waiting just outside? What if a mountain lion caught my scent and was waiting for me to emerge? I shivered, and not just from the cold. I listened hard. The silence prevailed, and it was just as disconcerting as ever. An absence of sound did not mean an absence of threats. God damn it, how hard was it to install a working toilet inside? Deep breath. Another. 10 deep breaths, and I jumped up, burst through the door into the darkness. I could feel the debris that littered the ground biting at my bare feet, and I didn't care. I only cared about reaching the door before something pounced on me. I was at the door before I remembered to take a breath. For some reason, I looked back before stepping inside. Maybe it was to prove to myself that I wasn't a total coward. Maybe I was just overconfident for having made it so far. Maybe I thought I heard a sound. I scanned the tree line with my flashlight, knowing I would regret it. In this, I did not disappoint myself. I saw something. I caught it in the beam of my flashlight for only a fraction of a second, but I saw it. Something passing from one tree to another, just beyond the yard. Something that walked on 2 legs. By the time I shut the door behind myself, I was certain I saw nothing, or nothing unusual. It was just a flash, after all. I was just seeing what I wanted to see. It was nothing. I didn't mention it to Jason. That was fast, he remarked, but he looked relieved. Cards? I asked, changing the subject. Sure, he said, gathering the deck and shuffling. Poker? Deal 'em, I said, pulling up a chair. We played cards for a couple of hours, barely speaking. I didn't think about the thing I didn't see. I didn't think about it at all. My calf itched where I had the razor burn, and I scratched at it compulsively. Jason must have thought this was a tell because he kept anteing up and losing hands. Eventually, I guess I started to get a little loopy from all the stress and the fatigue, and so without thinking about it, I asked him outright what I was thinking. Maybe a couple of hours of what seemed like normality disarmed me somewhat. Jason? Yeah, hun? He asked, peering over his hand. Is this real? I don't get your meaning, he said cautiously. I sighed and set down my own hand. I had 2 pairs, 3s and 8s. Can I be totally honest with you? Of course, he replied. I don't want you to think you got to hide anything from me. You have to know how this looks to me. I'm not calling you a liar, but I don't believe in aliens and abductions. I don't claim to know what happened exactly the night, but I can't wrap my head around the idea that you were zapped aboard a spaceship and taken away by little green men. Gray, he said, frowning. Green, gray, whatever. I'm sorry. What I'm saying is, Uncle Jason, you kidnapped me. I could feel the tears rolling down my cheeks. Somehow, I hadn't run out of them yet. You drugged me, tied me up, threw me in your van, and took me to some cabin in the woods, and I don't know what you're going to do, but damn it, I'm scared. Are you going to kill me? Just tell me. Are you going to kill me? He surprised me then. He burst into tears. Of his own. Not just a little either. Whatever I said, it broke the dam. He cried into his hands and shook. I wanted to comfort him in spite of everything, but I couldn't move. I was shocked. I had never even seen a grown man cry before, and it floored me completely. Uncle? Jason? I'm sorry, Please, I stammered. I started bawling again. Cried together in that cabin, over our playing cards, the table like a wall between us. We could offer each other no comfort, islands unto ourselves. Finally, he composed himself enough that he could speak again. His voice was ragged, and his eyes still ran with tears. I'm so sorry, Janie. I guess I don't blame you for thinking that. I guess there's no way I could convince you. I'm just trying. You know, I'm just a fuck-up. You know that. Shit, you're too smart to have a piece of shit like me. For an uncle, it's no secret my past is checkered. While my brothers studied and got jobs, I got drunk, and I got stoned, and I stole, and I cheated my way through life. I lived for no one but me, and I got everything I deserved. Uncle, I started, but he waved me silent. No one ever had a reason to believe me. I know that. Hell's bells. I guess I'm just about the cliché of the hillbilly UFO nut. So I know how this must look to you. You already pieced it together too. I don't have a plan. I just heard what you said and knew I had to do something. No big surprise. I fucked this up too. But I swear to you, before God, Janie girl, I didn't kidnap you to do you any harm. I told you that, and I mean it. I just... He began sobbing again, and I couldn't help myself. I still couldn't believe him, but I felt that he believed it, and in the moment, I just felt so bad for him. I crossed the table, and I held him. He cried into my shoulder, with his arms wrapped around me. I forgot to be afraid of him. I'm in hell, he cried. It's been damn near 10 years, and I can't sleep for fear I'll wake and see their lights. Feel that terrible vibration. Every time I close my eyes, I see their blank faces staring at me like I was a bug on a pin. I'm so goddamned afraid all the time, and I can't let you live like that too. Okay, Uncle. Okay. I comforted him, feeling like a fool and knowing it was the right thing to do, all at the same time. Let's say I'll give you the benefit of the doubt. So long as you don't do anything to make me think differently, I'll believe that you have my best interests at heart. But we can't stay here forever. A couple of days, and we go back home. I'll take your side and stick up for you with Mom and Dad. Try to make sure they don't press charges. Is that a deal? Yeah, honey, that's a deal, he said. I guess if you never find out, for sure if I'm telling you true about all the things I've seen, that'll be for the best. That's what I want. That's the plan. So we wait a couple of days, and if nothing happens to us, you go home to your folks. Here's something else. Insurance, you might say. What's that? I asked, a little warily. Here, he said, reaching into his bag. He pulled out a hunting knife in a leather scabbard and passed it to me. No, I protested, pushing the knife away. I don't want... Please, he said, pushing it back. Just hold onto it. If you feel like you can't trust me or you're in trouble, don't think. Just use it. You should be able to protect yourself. I insist you take it. I took it. It would have been foolish not to, really. It was the very thing I had been wishing for only hours before. I threaded the scabbard through my belt, and I felt better for having it. Less scared. Let's have some music, Jason said, his voice still raw. I've got fresh batteries in the stereo and a few tapes. What do you say? Sure, I said. The love I had for classic rock inherited from my dad alienated me from the kids my age a bit, but it was the one thing Jason and I had in common. He gestured toward the tape deck, a box of cassettes beside it. Take your pick. I opened the box and rifled through the assortment. Creedence, Stones, Beatles, Marshall Tucker Band, Styx, another Beatles, Stevie Ray Vaughan, and there it was. The Doors, Louisiana, Woman, probably my all-time favorite band and my all-time favorite album. The Changeling came first, with its killer thudding bass line. Morrison's voice came on, all growls and swagger. I ain't never been so broke that I couldn't leave town, he declared. I danced my way to the couch and sprawled out, tapping time on my knees. By the time Changeling transitioned to Love Her Madly, I had all but forgotten my dire situation. I could have been back in my room, sprawled out on the bed instead of a musty couch, alone instead of trapped with my unhinged uncle. I opened an eye. Jason was still at the table, nodding his head and dealing out solitaire yet again. He looked desperately tired, which was no surprise. He must not have slept at all last night, and for all I know, he hadn't been sleeping much before that. He said as much, and I believed that part. As I watched, he pulled a bottle from his coat pocket, which he had draped over the chair before sitting. He dumped out a couple of pills into his hand and knocked them back, swallowed them dry. He must have seen my look of alarm. It's just caffeine, he told me. See? He lobbed the bottle to me, and I could see that he was telling the truth. The pills in the bottle matched the photo on the label. I lobbed the bottle back to him, which he caught deftly. Jim informed us that he had been down so goddamn long it looked like up to him. Gotta stay up, he informed me. Keep a lookout, you know? What are you going to do if they come? I wondered. Try to stop them. He told me flatly. He would say no more. If I thought the aliens were going to come, I guess I would have been worried about our chances. I had no further questions. For a while, I continued to fantasize of being transported, as if by magic, away from this place and present company. The title track came on, my favorite, on the entire album. I was almost asleep again when the tape ended. Across the room, to flip to the other side. The window was closed, but darkness leaked through a crack between the shutters. I stared at it for a moment, perhaps pondering the endless expanse of wilderness that separated me from salvation. For just a moment, while the first slow, droning notes of L'America reverberated in the emptiness of the cabin, I thought I saw a light, and excitement rose up inside of me. Was it the headlights or the flashlights of my saviors? I didn't think it could be lightning, because it wasn't raining, and I heard no thunder. I turned to Jason, but he didn't seem to have noticed it. He was focused on finding a place for the Three of Hearts. I realized I had to hide any evidence of excitement on my face, for fear of giving myself and potential rescue away. I bopped back to the couch, plopped down, waiting. By the time Crawling King Snake came on, I had begun to wonder if I had just imagined the light, or if it was just a reflection of the lamp on the window pane. By the time my second favorite song on the album, The Wasp, Texas Radio, and the Big Beat, cut off, I was certain of it. Before Riders on the Storm ended, I had fallen asleep. I was rudely awakened sometime later to silence, and the feeling of hands on my arms, shaking me. Jason's hands. This was it. I cried out and groped at my side for the knife. Only it was the wrong side. He covered my mouth with his sweaty palm and urged me to be quiet with his eyes. My heart pounded in my chest like Densmore's drums. Carefully, he guided my face to the window across the room. Bluish light seeped from the cracks between the shutters, steady this time, not furtive at all. I saw that the light radiated from under the doorframe as well. The police. My gaze was turned back to Jason's face. I could see panic vibrating through his expression. No, not panic. Terror. It was either infectious, or I had plenty of my own. Listen very carefully, he hissed, just at the point of audibility. I could smell chips and cigarettes on his breath. You have to do exactly what I say. Nod if you understand. I nodded. He lifted me up, hand still clamped over my mouth, and gestured toward a door to the left of the kitchen and next to a heavy bookshelf. See that door? He asked, as if I could have missed it. That there's the closet. Should be empty. Get inside that closet, and don't make a single peep. Not if you value your life. If that closet door opens, and I don't holler an all clear first, you stab the first thing that comes through that door quick as a shot. You got it? Nod if you got it. I nodded. Now nod if you promise you ain't gonna yell out if I pull my hand away. You promise? I nodded once again. Slowly he drew away his hand, ready to slap it back down if I looked like I was going to break my promise. Satisfied, he shoved me toward the closet. I didn't see what else I could do but obey, and so I scrambled to my feet and shut myself into the closet. I tried not to think of how many spiders might have been nesting in the dark recesses therein, or maybe I had worse things to fear, like the actions of a desperate man at the end of his rope. Outside the door, I could hear a strange scraping sound, and I realized to my further terror that he was blocking the closet door with that heavy bookshelf. I wasn't going to get out unless someone let me out. Oh, Jesus. For a time after that, the silence was as total as the darkness. My mind raced with the possibilities of what might be transpiring outside. What if the police shoot Jason and no one finds me here? I would starve, and maybe in 50 years, some hiker will break in and find my bones wrapped in spiderwebs, like some old haunted house movie. I cried again, silently in the dark, and waited for my fate to find me. A terrible sound rent the silence, a sound like a rabbit who just found itself in the jaws of a ravenous wild dog. It was Jason. He was screaming. I could hear rage mingling with the horror, fighting for dominance. My heart quailed at the sound. It was not the sound of someone confronting a rescue team. It was the sound of someone confronting their worst fear in the flesh. My chest began to burn, and I realized I had forgotten to breathe. The reedy whistling sound of my gasping breath frightened me, and I had a second realization. I was suddenly afraid of being found near as much as lost. I tried to shrink back further into the closet, but there was no more room for retreat. A shot rang out. Another. Jason cried out again, this time in triumph. I didn't even know he had a gun, not for sure. Shots rang out one after the other, with Jason's cries and oaths filling the silence between. I could smell the gunpowder. After a time, I realized something else. No one was shooting back. All of the gunshots were coming from the same place. What was happening out there? Was this just another fantasy? Jesus, could he have set the lights up himself? But that was stupid. No matter how far out in the sticks we happened to be, all these gunshots could be heard by someone. Surely, he wouldn't be so foolish as to give himself away like that without good reason, right? Of course, I had to remind myself that he was not thinking rationally, and I could not put too much faith into his reasoning skills. Silence again. Was it over? I waited, and waited, and waited. The only thing I could hear outside the closet was Jason's footsteps. Near as I could tell, he was crossing from one window to another and back again. Tension wound a steel spring in my guts. If it was over, whatever it actually was, why didn't he give the all clear? He was still again. What did he see? What was he waiting for? I got my answer in the form of a slamming sound from the other side of the cabin, the back door. Fuck, Jason cried, and I could hear him stomping away. You motherfuckers won't take me again. He bellowed, the sound muffled somewhat by the cabin walls that separated us. Gunfire again. Wild shots that seemed to be aimed everywhere around him. I pressed myself down onto the floor for fear that a stray bullet would punch through the walls and hit me. I bit down on a scream, letting through only a sort of strained whistling sound that surely could not be heard over the thunder of guns, as AC/DC would have put it. As quickly as they came, the gunshots stopped, but not Jason's cries. He bellowed every profanity I knew, and many that were new to me. He bellowed threats of every kind. He vowed to tear the dirty grey bastards limb from scrawny limb, to gouge their lifeless black eyes out of their heads, to rip their throats out with his teeth if he had to. Funny, that was almost the exact line of threats I made against him hours ago. Then he ran. He ran my way. He ran past. He must have been out of ammunition. Come and get me then, you grey cowards, he called back. I heard him slam the door as he leaped out into the yard. Why? Moments later, I heard the sound of footsteps coming down the hall again. These ones were lighter and less hurried, but there were considerably more of them. Who was out there really? And why did it sound like they were barefoot? The footsteps stopped somewhere in the living room, and I waited to be found, unable to even breathe. I didn't wait long. They didn't find me, though. They found Jason. First, I heard a sound like a low-pitched hum, like some obscure electrical device cycling up to full power. The next thing I heard were the screams. Not the same as before. There was terror in these screams, yes, but mostly there was pain. If I lived to be 100 years old, I hoped to never hear that agonized sound again. It went on and on, probably just for the span of a few seconds, but it seemed like an eternity. Next was silence, and the silence prevailed for hours. I sat there motionless until my muscles ached and protested and cramped viciously. I could hear nothing save for my own tortured respiration. It must have been daylight again before I dared to escape the closet. For a petite teenage girl, forcing the door open with the heavy bookcase resting against it was a tall order, but I threw myself against the door again and again until I was afraid I would break every bone in my body. I pushed, and I struggled, and I fought for every inch of progress. At last, I could squeeze through, and I emerged from the closet into an empty cabin. The keys to Jason's truck, for a miracle, was sitting on the table. Did he know then that I would be left on my own? He must have. Why else would he have removed them from his pocket? I snatched them up and investigated the rest of the cabin. He was nowhere to be seen, but that was no surprise. The walls were dotted with bullet holes, and that was no surprise ever. Kitchen was trashed, but I saw no blood or bodies, just shattered dishes and exploded cans. What happened here? Really? Finally, I decided I had to leave. There was nothing for me there, if there ever was in the first place. It certainly wasn't the sanctuary that Jason hoped it would be. Having nothing to gather, I stepped out the door into the morning sun and the chill of early winter, and a terrible shock. Midway to the tree line was a black spot, perfectly round and burned into the dead grass and weeds. At the center of the spot was Jason, or what was left of him. Whatever burned into the ground burned into him as well, leaving nothing but blackened bones still steaming with heat. His remains were twisted, contorted into a terrible, unnatural position. His jaw hung open, as if screaming silently, eternally. I could almost hear the sound from hours ago. I would hear it again in my dreams for years to come. The fire did not spread an inch past that circle. I don't know how that could be possible, but it was. I stared into that circle, tears running down my eyes and a flood of emotions welling up within me. Did this mean? Was my uncle right? Was that possible? What else could have done this? Why did he leave? Was he trying to draw them away from me? That must have been it. I mourned him there. I should have gotten in the van and fled that terrible place. And eventually, I would. First, though, I mourned. I hated him, and I feared him. Like so many others, I never gave him a chance. I called him a liar, and I never wavered in that conviction. Maybe he deserved better. I saw something of him that night, something I never expected. I saw a sadness, a loneliness beyond measure. I saw a man who fell victim to his own weaknesses again and again over the course of his life, and couldn't wall away the pain it caused others as well as himself. And I saw someone who must have loved me more than I ever knew. He would risk everything to protect me from dangers he believed in with all his heart. It didn't matter now if those dangers were real or the product of a fevered imagination. Was it courageous, what he did? Was it foolish? Was it even the right thing to do? Maybe I would know when I was older and had the time to think about it. He wouldn't have the same luxury. Whatever happened here last night, he died for me. I know that. I stared up from the burn, from my uncle's blackened bones. I stared up past the trees into the cloudless sky. Above me stretched endless expanse of space that was either devoid of all life or populated by beings I could not imagine. Both possibilities terrified me. I would never be that girl who stared up at the stars with a boy and felt joy, felt safe. Sometime later, I managed to find a way out of that forest and back to the real world. I found a phone and called my parents. The rest was a circus, just like the one my uncle faced. I was glad when it was over and I could just pretend to be a teenage girl again who liked a boy and worried about nothing more sinister than college applications. If I suffered from terrible nightmares, who could blame me? It was a traumatic event I lived through, and a few bad dreams were par for the course. If I feared open windows and certain colors of light, that was to be expected. In time, I would get over it, even if I needed therapy to do so. Just a couple of things. Those bumps on my leg, the razor burn, they never quite went away. They stopped itching, sure, but the swelling never quite went all the way down. Probably nothing to worry about. I would make Mom take me to the dermatologist if it ever changed shape or anything. But then there's the other thing, and that thing worries me a lot. I'm pregnant. Not just late, I'm pregnant. And I'm still a virgin, and I'm frightened of what may be growing inside of me.